Hello and welcome to my channel. This is my charcoal drawing of a howling wolf. I'm going to be using charcoal pencils, vine charcoal, the usual stuff. Let me show you the drawing process. I'm starting with a sketch. For some reason I like to start with the ears. That is what I often do. The size of the paper is going to be the usual size that I work on, 9 times 12 inches or so. The charcoal pencils I'm using are Kohinoor charcoal pencils. I'm mostly going to be using a soft charcoal pencil. It's called Gioconda Extra Charcoal pencil. And I'm going to be using a variety of blending tools and erasers. First things first, if you like this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe and comment. And if you want to see longer videos, you can always check out my Patreon for additional content and full-length narrated videos where you can observe the drawing process in real time. Anyway, I'm using a piece of vine charcoal, a vine charcoal stick, to shade the background, and as you can see I worked around the edge, the top edge of the wolf's head, and I'm going to draw a slightly darker background, but the background is mostly going to be blurry. There's not going to be anything specific in there. I may create a little bit of variation in terms of value here and there, but it's mostly going to be dark grey. So just a wolf howling in the night. And I'm going to focus mostly on my main subject. Now let me say a few words about how I approach doing this background. So I used vine charcoal first, and vine charcoal is easy to blend. It's easy to blend it smoothly, it's easy to smudge it around. It doesn't really stick to the paper as much as compressed charcoal. Now I like to use it in a combination with either charcoal pencils or charcoal powder. And I create this charcoal powder by sharpening some of my charcoal pencils. And the reason why I like to use this combination and not just one or the other is because the charcoal powder is a bit darker, so it allows me to create some areas of darker value. But vine charcoal is lighter and more easily moved, so when I combine these two, I kind of have a little bit more control when adding or taking away value, and when I want to create some lighter or darker areas in the background. And it's easier for me to move that charcoal dust around and create some almost painterly effects using brushes mostly. But I also use my fingers, and the reason why I use both of these blending tools is because they behave differently. When you use a finger, you tend to push the charcoal into the paper and you tend to make it stick a little bit better because of the texture of your finger and the natural oils of your skin. But when you use brushes, you tend to move the charcoal a bit more and blend everything a bit more smoothly, especially if you're using a larger brush, which is what I did here. Now here I'm moving on to the main part of the drawing process. I'm using a charcoal pencil and I'm starting to work on the ear. There's a bit of darker hair around the edge of the ear, around the tip of that ear. And let me just explain briefly how I'm going to approach drawing the wolf and its fur. So there are a number of ways you can approach the drawing and shading process. You can start from the larger relationships, shading the larger areas, or you can start from details, or you can do a bit of a combination of both, which is what I like to do. And one of the things that I like to do is I like to put in some of the darkest bits because they help me navigate both in terms of the proportion and the placement of the different areas of darker and lighter value, and they also help me gauge how much value I need in different places. Now after I put in some of these darker areas, these shadow areas for example, the mouth, the nose, the eyes, or some of the shadow areas in between the folds in the fur coat. After that, I'm going to use a piece of vine charcoal and shade the larger part of the wolf's body. So that's going to be the second stage, where I establish the contrast between the lighter portions of the main subject and the darker portions. And here it's not that easy to define the light side and the shadow side. Sometimes there is a clear contrast between the light side and the shadow side. Here it's not going to be that easy. The light is coming from above, but there's a little bit of light coming from not just from the top, but also from the right, and somehow the part of the wolf which is, or the side of the wolf which is facing towards us, towards the viewer, is going to be a bit darker. But before I move on to defining that, I am going to draw these darker areas. And as you can see, I'm pulling kind of thick, larger strokes with my charcoal pencil, and I'm actually using quite a bit of pressure, because I want to produce very dark and large marks. And these darker areas that I just defined are some of the darker areas in the fur. And it's not just those parts of the body where the fur is a little bit darker, but also where there is a little bit more shadow, because the fur is longer in those parts of the body. And because the fur is longer, it's kind of creating these larger clumps of fur, and there are some shadow areas in between them. So when you have longer hair, these longer clumps of fur which are sticking out, they are going to be a lot lighter, and the spaces in between them are going to be a lot darker, almost completely black, because those are the shadow areas. And now comes that part of the drawing process, or the shading process, where I'm using a piece of vine charcoal to shade the better part of the wolf's body. So I'm kind of looking at my reference photo and trying to see which parts of the body are a bit darker than the others, and I'm trying to shade those using this piece of vine charcoal. The vine charcoal is very good for shading these larger areas. It's going to allow me to move that large amount of charcoal very quickly, and I'm going to push it in and push it around using brushes. So, like I said, when you're looking at your reference photo, I don't really know how you normally use your reference photos, but I normally have mine on an iPad and I zoom in and out all the time. When I want to do some of the details, I normally zoom in to about the same size that my drawing is. But when I want to get these larger relationships right, then I zoom out and I look at a smaller version of the photo, and that can actually help me see these larger relationships more easily. Another thing that kind of helps especially when you're working with more detailed, high quality or larger resolution photos, is to squint your eyes a little bit, and then it's a little bit easier to understand which parts of your subject are the lightest and where you should put more shadow. Now the next stage, once I established some of these darker areas or shadow areas, is to work on the texture of the fur a little bit, and there's no way around this. This is a bit of a slow process, and you have to draw this by pulling very short strokes. And as always, when you're drawing animals that have fur, you have to keep in mind two rules when drawing fur. You have to make sure that your strokes, your pencil strokes, match the length of the fur and the direction of the fur. So if the fur is kind of growing or flowing downwards, that's how I need to pull my strokes. I need to pull them downwards. If the fur is short in that part of the body that I'm drawing right now, I need to create shorter strokes. if the fur gets longer around the neck area or the chest area, I need to pull longer strokes. So this is just something you have to do in order to create a realistic looking texture of the fur, because if you don't do these two things, you're just going to end up with something that looks kind of messy and not particularly realistic. Now, I'm not saying that you can't draw a realistic animal without actually drawing every single detail on the fur and the body, but the thing, naturally, those larger relationships, those larger contrasts are more important than details and texture. But I'm saying that when you're doing these slightly larger, more detailed drawings where you want to capture a little bit more of the details on the fur and the body, then you might want to pay attention to some of these finer details and how you render them and how you explain them to the viewer. Because if you don't do it properly, you're going to end up with an ugly looking texture that doesn't really resemble your subject, the thing that you're drawing. So I mentioned my reference photo and how I approached drawing it and using it. I'm going to put it in the description of the video, and if you want to check that out. I obtained the reference photo by simply taking a screenshot of one of the videos with wolves, and I just like this particular moment when the wolf was howling. I know that probably a lot of people on the internet have done similar drawings, but sometimes different people are inspired by the same thing or a similar thing. So I hope that you like my version of the howling wolf. I have drawn wolves on a number of occasions. I just sold one of my older drawings of a wolf the other day, and I've also done a larger portrait of a wolf. That's one of my most popular videos here on YouTube, and I wanted this one to be also a slightly larger, more detailed drawing of a wolf, but this one is slightly different because the wolf is howling, and it kind of feels a little bit more dynamic. And I'm going to add some details to the background a little bit later. So now I'm moving on to the next stage of refining the texture of the fur, and now I'm not using a pencil, I'm using an eraser. So your erasers are your drawing tools, not just correcting tools but also drawing tools, because with your pencils you draw darker shapes and darker lines. With your erasers you draw lighter shapes and lighter lines by taking away value. Now there are different ways to take away value, and I want to say a few words about that because that will maybe be useful here in this video. One of the most common ways to take away value and to achieve a lighter line or a lighter shape is by erasing. You can either use a pencil eraser, which is what I'm using now most of the time for these smaller hairs, and I'm using a Kohino pencil eraser, by the way, and that's the one that I like best, and it's easily available to me. And you can also use a kneaded eraser. I use kneaded eraser sometimes, but for slightly different things. I normally use that Faber-Castell kneaded eraser that you see on the left of my drawing, and you have to mold it and to whichever shape that you need. So erasers are one of the ways to achieve that. Now the other way is to reserve the white space. You simply don't draw over an area, and I normally like to do that when I have clear white or light portions of my drawing that I can simply avoid working on, and when I leave them clean, I can use that white space to create some nice contrast a bit later. Now there are some other alternative ways of removing the charcoal or graphite, whatever it is that you're working with, without actually erasing. And the way to do that is by using your blending tools. Normally, when we think of blending tools, we think of tools that we use to push the charcoal around, to push it into the paper, and they normally tend to make things darker, and they tend to leave darker marks. Your blending tools can also be used as drawing tools. Here, as you can see, I'm refining the texture of the fur under the neck, and you can see how I'm trying to group that fur into slightly larger clumps of fur. This is very important because you can't draw every single hair, and you can't just draw a mess of white lines. You need to make sense out of that hair by grouping it a little bit. And you can see that there's a little bit of shadow between the head and the neck, where the hair is, where the fur is a little bit longer, and where the head is kind of twisting. So wherever the body is twisting, there will be some folds in the skin and the fur, and those will be the shadow areas. And you can see that I've already defined some of these larger shadow areas in between those layers of fur, where the body is kind of twisting and where we have some skin folds or folds in the fur. Back to what I was saying about taking away value with your blending tools. When you use a clean tortillon or a clean brush, it will actually lift up a little bit of the charcoal or whatever material you're working with, and it will create an area of slightly lighter value. This is very useful when you want to create some softer marks which may not be quite as light as if you were using an eraser, because when you use an eraser you tend to create a bit more contrast and you tend to lift up or remove a bit more of the charcoal. But when you use your blending tools, you can create some softer, lighter shapes, and this is very useful when you're drawing fur, because when you want to create some of these soft, fluffy, lighter clumps of fur, you don't really have to erase every single detail. Sometimes you can just go over some of them with a clean brush or a clean tortillon. You can lift up a little bit of value, and you can actually create some lighter shapes without actually using an eraser. Now you can do the same thing with a background. If you want to create some areas of lighter value in the background, and I'm going to be doing that a bit later, and I'm going to explain why and how, you can actually use your blending tools to lift up a little bit of charcoal without erasing, or you can use a combination of erasers and blending tools to lift up some charcoal. Now, I did a lot of that background, and I should probably say a few words about it, because I already talked about my approach to blending and which materials I used, but there are a few more things that I need to tell you. But before I do that, I just want to explain what I'm doing here. As you can see, I shaded the larger part of the body, and now I'm pretty much shading around it, drawing the background. As you can see, I drew a lot of these darker areas to indicate that there are some shadow areas in between those clumps of fur, and I wanted to break that fur into smaller segments of hair, smaller clumps of fur, so that it would look more realistic. And later I'm going to refine that texture a little bit using some of my erasers. But back to what I was saying about the background. So as you can see, there is a very nice clean edge between the background and my main subject. This is very important because you want to have a clean edge there. You want to show exactly where the background begins and where your subject ends, obviously. And you can't have a blurry edge there. It's very good to have a nice clean contrast, a clean edge to value, as some people call it. And to achieve that, you have to shade all the way to the edge, and you have to make sure that the area around that edge is dark enough. Because one of the things that happens when people try to draw a slightly darker background or a shaded background is they tend to leave a slightly lighter area around their subject, and that produces some sort of a glowing halo effect. That's not a good look. Sometimes you may want to do that deliberately depending on what you're trying to achieve, but it's usually not a very good idea. Usually you want to have a nice, clean, sudden contrast, and this is what I try to achieve here. As you can see on the fur, I also used a piece of vine charcoal for some of these larger clumps of fur, and the piece of vine charcoal really helps you with those larger strokes. Now here I'm using my charcoal pencil to draw some darker areas here around the back and the ear, because I kind of wanted to connect that shadow area, those shadow areas on the back and the neck, to explain the shape of the wolf a little bit better to the viewer, because when you connect some of these shadow areas, that makes the lighter areas stand out more easily, and it enhances the contrast so that the viewer can immediately understand what they're looking at. It just gives you better looking shapes. So here I'm moving on to the background. I'm doing a little bit more work on the background, and one of the reasons why I'm progressing with the background so gradually is because I like to work from top to bottom and from left to right, because I'm right-handed and because charcoal is a very, very, very messy medium. So to prevent smudging and ruining the work that you've already done, it's better to work in a certain order. And one of the things that can help a little bit is a piece of glassine paper if you put it under your hand, but it can only do so much, so it's better to work in the proper order. And here you can see that I'm using a pencil eraser to draw some of the finer details on that fur. So I drew the darker tones and the mid-tones, and now I'm pulling highlights using a sharp pencil eraser and drawing some of these lighter hairs or lighter fur or lighter clumps of fur, some of them larger than the others. Sometimes I draw one or two of these flyaway hairs and things like that. Basically I want to make it look random and realistic, but at the same time I'm trying to stay consistent with the overall texture and the direction of the fur, as well as the length of the fur, because remember what I told you when we were using pencil. To draw fur, you have to pull your strokes in the direction of the fur, and you have to make sure that your strokes match the length of your strokes matches the length of the fur. The same thing goes with the pencil eraser. So if you want to make sure that your fur is realistic, you have to obey the same rules when you're drawing the fur, either when you're using a pencil or a pencil eraser, because like I said, your pencil eraser is a drawing tool. It's just that it's a drawing tool for removing value and drawing lighter shapes or lighter details. So you can see here on this chest or shoulder area at the bottom here, I'm kind of finishing the work on the wolf's body, and I'm refining the texture by drawing some of these highlights. And it's a good idea when you have these darker shadow areas of fur, it's a good idea to pull a few highlights popping out of them as well, so that you can make it kind of look like, even though it's a shadow area or an area of darker fur, maybe there are some lighter hairs popping out, or maybe there are some clumps of fur which are jutting out or sticking out and catching more light from the light source. Anyway, I'm finishing the background here on the right. First I used a bit of vine charcoal, then a bit of charcoal powder, and then I'm spreading that with a brush. Like I said, I'm making sure that I have a nice clean edge between my main subject and the background. I am just making sure that some parts of that light side of my main subject are not too light. And now I'm going to draw some of these steam effects to draw the wolf's breath, and I'm going to do that by dabbing the charcoal with a bit of tissue first, and then with some with a kneaded eraser, just dabbing a little bit to take away a little bit of value. I just want to make it look like the wolf is howling and its breath is creating that white smoke, and it's probably the scene is probably taking place in cold weather. So that's kind of the atmosphere that I wanted to achieve. I also had a half thought about adding maybe some snow, maybe some drops of snow, but I didn't want to do that because I figured a lot of people have already done something similar, so I wanted my drawing to look slightly different. And now I'm just putting down some of the finishing touches, just refining some of the details and the textures on the wolf's head and some other areas. The drawing is almost done. Once again, I want to remind you, if you like this video, don't forget to check out my other videos and don't forget to subscribe. The drawing is finished. I'm going to put my signature in the lower right corner. It's not going to be too conspicuous. I think that's a good place for a signature. This is what the drawing looks. I hope you like it. Also, I think I've already mentioned, if you want to see longer full-length videos, you should definitely check out my Patreon. Maybe I'm just going to take away a tiny bit of value and draw a few lighter hairs here around the neck and the chest area. But I think the drawing looks good, and I think I'm now finished. I want to thank you for watching this one. I hope you liked it, and of course I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.